Okay, so for this presentation, we're going to cover chapter 2 in the textbook. And graph theory is good because it allows for unifying language for networks. So let's take a look at it. Now, be aware that the definitions in this realm are a bit fluid. So you might have different definitions than what we discuss in programming 2 or in discrete mathematics. In the words of John Barnes, graph theory is a terminological jungle in which any newcomer can plant a tree. So let's go ahead and sow some seeds here and come up with some definitions that they're using in the textbook. So a graph is a way of specifying relationships among a collection of different items. It consists of objects that are called the nodes, and these nodes are connected by links, which are called edges. Two nodes are neighbors if they are connected by an edge. So here, A, B, C, and D are the nodes. There's an edge between A and B, an edge between B and C, an edge between C and D, and an edge between B and D. So B and D would be neighbors in this graph. A directed graph is one in which the arrows have directions or the links have directions. Each directed edge is a link from one node to another. So in here, you can get from A to B, but you cannot get back from B to A. Once you're a B, you're not going to go back and visit A. So the direction is actually important. This figure that we saw on the previous slide was an undirected graph. And that way you could go either way. But this one, you can only go one way, the way indicated by the arrow. So graphs work as models for our networks. And this is what ARPANET, the forerunner to the internet, looked like in 1970. And boy, the internet's expanded a lot since I was born. Now, you can remove the geographic information from the top figure and you get a more abstract graph. So some other examples of different graphs that we might find in real life. Of course, there's airline routes. Here's Hawaiian Airlines. And again, you never really fully appreciate how big Hawaii is until you look at the Hawaiian Airlines route map. The Big Island could take up a massive part of California if it were plopped down in there. Anyway, you can see the individual cities that Hawaiian Airlines flies to as nodes, and then the individual routes would be the edges. So, there would be a node at Hilo and an edge going to Honolulu. There's one from Kona going to Kahului and one from Kona going over to Honolulu. You can see edges also going down to Sydney, Australia, which I've actually taken that flight before. Haven't been to Tahiti or Samoa yet, but those are on the list. And I guess now they're flying to New Zealand, or they were at least prior to the pandemic. Metro maps are also graphs. The individual stations would be the nodes, and a route connecting the individual stations would be the edges. This one's the Tokyo Metro, and if you look closely at it, you can actually see the JR Yamanote line, which is the gray dashes. That's technically not a part of the Tokyo Metro, but it's a very popular route on Japan Rail, and it's often known as the merry-go route. I figured I'd go with Tokyo for this lecture because I cover Beck's map of the underground in CS2. Course maps. This is our course map here at UH Hilo in terms of what you need to do in order to graduate with a degree in computer science. And I'm not sure why CS485, this class, has a prominent place within it because it's not listed that way in the catalog. But it's all the better if you want to argue that you need this course in order to graduate. But this is what actually appears on the website. This one was a really interesting example from the text. This is the Tank Street Bridge in Brisbane, Australia. And it's an example of a structural network which joins its nodes and physical linkages as the edges. The internal frameworks of mechanical structures, such as buildings, vehicles, or human bodies, are based on such networks in the area of rigidity theory. In the intersection of geometry and mechanical engineering, if you've ever rigged up an animated figure before, then you'll kind of know this principle. So paths and cycles are also important within graphs, and a path is a sequence of nodes with the property that each consecutive pair in the sequence is connected by an edge. Sometimes it's also useful to think of the path as containing not just the nodes, but also the sequence of edges that connect these nodes. If it doesn't repeat nodes, it's a simple path. A cycle is a path with at least 3 edges in which the first and last nodes are the same, but otherwise all the nodes are distinct. And if you look back at the ARPANET slide, it's actually full of cycles, and that was in order to prevent failure of the entire system if one node were to fail. And the picture here is Florida. Connectivity is another important property of graphs. The graph is connected if for every pair of nodes, there's a path between them. Connected component of a graph is a subset of the nodes such that every node in the subset has a path to every other node in the subset. And the subset is not a part of a larger set with the property that every node can reach each other. And if a graph's not connected, then it breaks apart naturally into a set of connected pieces like we see here. Groups of nodes so that each group is connected when considered as a graph in isolation, like the AB, the CED. Those are considered connected when considered in isolation, but as part of a whole graph, they're actually not. Now, most transportation networks are generally connected. But we might have disconnected pieces, such as the H1 freeway, when considering something like the US National Highway System. And again, pictured here is a graph with 3 connected components. There's also a theory called giant components, and large complex networks often have this giant component. And it's a deliberately informal term for a connected component that contains a significant fraction of all the nodes within the network. All it takes is a single connection to merge 2 giant components, and you could actually see that when Europeans were first colonizing the Western Hemisphere. There were the component that existed in the Western Hemisphere and the European component, and when they merged, kind of bad things happen. The author references a book called Guns, Germs, and Steel, which is kind of a famous historical book that's definitely worth a read. And the notion of giant components is useful for reasoning about networks on much smaller scales as well. Your ties of friendships, considering the entire world as friends or relations, actually have a giant component to them. And, it's not completely connected. For example, someone who outlived all their friends and didn't have any friends anymore, or the good folks over on North Sentinel Island, those would definitely not be connected to the rest of us. In the figure, what we have here is we have romantic relationships at a high school. And you can see the giant component in the upper left. The researchers were actually studying the transmission of sexually transmitted diseases. And they could very easily look at how those diseases were transmitted within networks by doing these structural graphs. The other thing that we might be interested in from graphs in terms of our social networks is distance, and we can obtain that using breadth first search. So the length of a path is the number of steps it contains from beginning to end, and the distance between 2 nodes in a graph is the length of the shortest path between. We can actually use breadth first traversal to find the distance between the 2 nodes. So breadth first traversal of a graph searches the graph outward from the starting point using a level by level traversal. If the traversal has just visited a node V, then it visits all the nodes adjacent to V. And it puts the vertices adjacent to those in a waiting list or a queue to be traversed after all the vertices adjacent to V have been visited. So let's try with this graph. We can start here at location 0. Now we'll visit the 3 neighbors and in the order from top to bottom, 1, 2, and 3. And we visit 1's neighbor, 4. Visit 2's neighbor, 5. 3 doesn't have any more neighbors to visit, so 4 is next in the queue, so we will visit 4's neighbor. Now 5 has a neighbor, we'll visit that, that's 7. And then finally we will visit 7's neighbor, since that's the only one that's been added to the queue at the end, and that's 8. So the small world phenomenon is the world looks small when you think of how short a path it is from friends through your friendship network to get to almost anyone else. It's also known perhaps more memorably as the 6 degrees of separation. Now I'm going to do a little bit of the sidebar here and talk about that 6 degrees of separation. And this was first coined as part of a experiment that was done by Stanley Milgram and his colleagues. Yes, that's Stanley Milgram back in the 1960s. And so they didn't really have a huge, massive social network data set like we have today, and they only had a budget of $680. So he set out to test the speculative idea that people were really more connected in the global friendship network by short chains of friends. So he asked a collection of 296 randomly chosen starters to try to forward a letter to a target person. He couldn't send it directly through the mail. This was a stockbroker who lived in a suburb of Boston. The starters were given some personal information about the target, including his address and occupation. Although, again, they couldn't directly mail that to him through the U.S. Postal Service. They were asked to forward the letter to someone they knew on a first name basis with the same instructions in order to eventually reach the target as quickly as possible. Each letter thus passed through a number of hands in the sequence of friends in succession, and they formed a chain of people that closed in on the stockbroker outside of Boston. The figure here is the distribution of the path links that took the 64 successful letters to get to the stockbroker. So few, it took one hop. They actually knew the stockbroker. Few more, they knew somebody who knew the stockbroker. For 3, they knew someone who knew someone who knew the stockbroker. And what you can see there is the median, and the mode for this graph is actually 6. So that's where we got the 6 degrees of separation. And, what does 6 degrees of separation really mean? And, it doesn't mean that there's 6 degrees between separation between us and everyone else on the planet. It doesn't mean that you can get that quick connection to the president to have him do whatever it is that you would like him to do. But, it does actually help spread information, and probably badly enough, it also helps to spread disease. You might even view it as a pessimist as being 6 worlds apart from other people, or people that are most distant from you on the planet. But the upshot of this is that social networks tend to have very short paths between arbitrary pairs of people. There are some variations on a theme in mathematics. There's the Erdos number, which is the distance from a author to Paul Erdos, who kind of sits at the center of the collaboration graph for mathematical writing. There's the Bacon number, which is the distance from an actor to Kevin Bacon in the Hollywood collaboration graph. And then there is the Sabbath number, which is the distance between a musician and Black Sabbath in the musical collaboration graph. Now, my Erdos number is 4, and I found that out using a tool that Microsoft Research had published. I believe my Bacon number is 4. Based on some people that I did some work with and did some performances with back when I was an undergraduate at the University of Michigan. And, the Sabbath number, that one's a little bit harder, but I'm guessing that's somewhere between 4 and 6 based on doing some Kanakapila with a guy by the name of Rick down at Hilo Guitar and Ukulele Shop. That put me at 14 for the Bacon Sabbath Erdos number. And that's not too bad. I'm definitely not Stephen Hawking, but I think I actually do have one. So that's good. It's not infinity on any of those. So how do you go about getting these data sets and graphs to study them? Again, we'd want to have these if we were interested in them. The author has a huge amount of interest in the Bacon number and film. We'd also want to have them if they stood as a good stand-in for other data, such as the Microsoft study that's referenced in the text, or if we wanted to compare the data set with other domains, if we thought there was a mapping between the domain of that data set and some other phenomenon that we were studying, if we thought we could make valid comparisons. So where do these come from? Well, collaboration graphs, scientific papers. If you have something like Access to ACM Digital Library or IEEE Explorer, you can see scientific papers and collaborators for individual authors within there. Wikipedia also has a collaboration graphs. Who talks with whom? There's a Microsoft Instant Message study that's referenced in the text that's kind of interesting, showing those giant connected components. Cell phones, send out Bluetooth signals, so you can see whose cell phone has been in close proximity with whose, and they actually use that for the alerts for COVID exposure if you have that turned on. Other places from information linkage graphs, working with a subset of the web, such as product reviews on shopping sites, technology networks, ARPANET that we looked at earlier in this presentation, and from the natural world. There's food webs, instead of who talks to whom, it's who eats whom. Suzanne Simard actually has an interesting book called The Mother Tree that shows how trees work together in ecosystems to communicate with one another. Mushrooms also actually have that. The part that you see that's above ground is actually just the fruit of the mushroom, but there's an entire network that's communicating below ground, or the neurons in our brain as depicted in this little meme template. I'll leave that to you to fill in. So that's the talk for the graphs, and hopefully you enjoyed the talk and reading through the textbook.